Welcome back. This week we're looking at Chapter 9 in Agnew and Brezina on labeling theory. I want to talk with you first about the dramatization of evil. This term is from work by Frank Tannenbaum, and labeling theory has its roots in his publication Crime and Community. Published in 1938, Tannenbaum said that a decisive step in becoming criminal is being arrested and having that arrest held up for public scrutiny. He said that, quote, tagging, defining, identifying, segregating, describing, emphasizing, making conscious and self-conscious the crime in question is key. It's the self-conscious part that is most important. It's when the criminal becomes aware that he or she is a criminal. The person begins to believe it, integrate it into their actions, and perpetuate it. Another piece to this puzzle comes from Edwin Lemert's 1951 publication, Social Pathology, a Systematic Approach to the Theory of Sociopathic Behavior. Now here, Lemert identified two types of deviance, primary and secondary. Primary deviance is what we've discussed thus far in the course. Delinquent acts in response to societal pressure, cultural expectations, strain, and so on. Delinquency is a means to an end. For example, a college student might drink a lot, but just sees him or herself as behaving like a typical college student, not a drunk. In other words, individuals dissociate themselves from their deviance. Now, contrast that primary deviance with secondary deviance. Secondary deviance is when the individual comes to identify with their deviance. It becomes part of their identity. The drunk, the thief, the killer, and so on. What causes the shift from primary to secondary deviance? According to Lemert, it's a gradual process of cycling from deviance to negative reactions from others, to more deviance, to more negative reactions, and so on and so forth. The more societal reaction there is over time, the more the individual will shift from primary to secondary deviance. Okay, fast forward to the 1960s and 70s. Criminologists pointed to the social construction of crime. That crime is not necessarily a societal given. Instead, crime is defined by society. For example, manslaughter, that is, killing without the intent to kill, was not always considered a crime. Now it is. The definition evolved. In 1963, Howard Becker published Outsiders, Studies in the Sociology of Deviance. He said that social groups create rules that define deviance. The infraction of those rules is labeled as deviance, and so the deviant is one to whom the label has been successfully applied. Some criminologists, again this was in the 1960s mostly, took this to the extreme and said that criminals are not criminals until we, society, label them as such. Most other criminologists laugh this off, but there's something to it. There's something about labeling a person as a criminal that can then lead to that person becoming, or at least staying, a criminal. Again, go back to Lemert's description of primary and secondary deviance. There's a lot more theory in Chapter 9, so be sure you cover contemporary labeling theory from researchers such as John Braithwaite, Ross Matsueda, and Lawrence Sherman. The key to remember is that somewhere along the line, individuals engage in delinquent behavior, and in the case of this course, we're talking about juveniles engaging in delinquency behavior, and become labeled as delinquents. If this happens often enough or harshly enough, they will begin to take on the persona of a delinquent, believing that they are delinquents. John Braithwaite focused his attention on what he called reintegrative shaming. He said that when no effort is made to reintegrate the juvenile back into conventional society, official and informal labels take hold. The delinquent behavior is exacerbated. But when presented with the case of a juvenile offender, the punishment should not be overly harsh. Conventional others, such as parents and teachers, should maintain relationships with the juvenile, that is, not reject him or her, and the juvenile should be asked to apologize and or make restitution or otherwise make up for the crime. To put it in the vernacular, condemn the sin, but not the sinner. These steps, Braithwaite said, can stop the vicious cycle of labeling. Strain is reduced. A stake in conformity grows, a la control theory. Social learning comes from caring friends and family. Emotional bonds form or reform. But a degree of shaming is required. The offender must learn that what he or she did is wrong. Okay, lastly, a note on the evidence to support labeling theory. Empirical research on labeling theory is scant. Braithwaite, Matsueda, and Sherman have conducted much of the research, but the data available to them are limited. Labeling can come from so many interconnected sources that large-scale surveys of those who have the potential to label are nearly impossible. Instead, labeling theory is much more of a social psychological theory, and much of the evidence in favor of the theory comes from clinical psychology, therapy, for example. Therapists writing reports and journal articles on what they have seen work best with their clients or patients. So that's it for me. Be sure to check out this week's quiz and discussion forum, and I'll see you online.